I remember the first time I realized how deeply I was willing to invest in another person's burdens. It was a few weeks before my 20th birthday, and I was still clinging to the naive hope that love was enough to sweep aside any financial mishap or ill-considered gamble. He was sitting across from me in my tiny, drafty kitchen, his head in his hands, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes as he confessed he'd lost everything. The dining table wobbled on uneven legs whenever he pressed his elbows on it. The overhead light flickered now and then, and each flicker made my heart jump. I think even then I understood what I was getting myself into, but I believed I could weather it. All I saw was a man who was vulnerable, remorseful, ashamed that he'd brought trouble to my door, and there was a moment, a fleeting fraction of an instant, when I felt powerful, like I could rescue him from his mistakes, show him that unconditional love wasn't a myth. I should have recognized how the dynamic of power was slipping between us, right then. The strength I thought I had was going to lock me into a life of quiet servitude. But I didn't see the chains being forged around my ankles. Not yet. I was too busy searching for ways to help him, determined to prove how unwavering I could be. I told him that we would find a way to make it work. He sighed with relief, grabbed my hands, and sobbed against my knuckles. I had never felt so needed. My mother had always warned me to avoid men who needed saving. She said it turned them into eternal victims, or worse, eternal predators who'd feed off the empathy of those too gentle to fight back. I brushed off her cautionary tales. I insisted that I was different, that my faith in him wasn't just a childish notion. I didn't want to believe I was one of those people destined to pour all of myself into a bottomless pit of another person's needs. I told myself that love was synergy, that we'd share the weight equally somehow. He promised me as much, anyway. He said we'd stand side by side, conquer the debts together, and that once we were free, we would build our dream life. We got married in that same rickety house, the one with the drafty kitchen and the wobbly table. We didn't have the money to do anything extravagant, so it was a modest affair, just a few close friends and family members. I still remember the way he looked at me when I walked down that tiny makeshift aisle. His eyes shone with gratitude and devotion, and I was certain the moment held a kind of unspoken vow that we would remain loyal, that every pain would be worth it, that someday we'd find bliss. My dress was borrowed, wrinkled at the edges and slightly too long. I had to pick it up to avoid tripping, but it felt like the most beautiful garment I'd ever worn because it symbolized transformation in my mind. I was no longer just a helper. I was a partner, a wife. A fierce optimism bubbled in my chest. I looked at him like he was the protagonist of my grand life story, a flawed but ultimately redeemable hero. I couldn't see the cracks forming under the surface. Over the first few years, I learned to juggle multiple jobs while he flitted from one endeavor to another, trying to patch the holes in our finances. He was always on the lookout for a big break or an opportunity that could free us from the vicious cycle of owing money to banks, to loan sharks, and sometimes even to friends or distant relatives. Whenever he stumbled upon a new scheme, he'd talk about it with such fervor that I almost believed we were on the cusp of a miracle. And I'd be so taken by his excitement that I didn't notice how I was the one shouldering the brunt of the day-to-day expenses. My paychecks went straight to rent, to utilities, to groceries. His sporadic earnings would temporarily soothe the cracks, but they never formed a true foundation. I told myself he was trying, that these were just the early struggles, that one day we'd look back and laugh about our naive but hopeful beginnings. My mother watched from a distance, and she'd occasionally voice her concerns. "Are you sure this is the life you want?" she'd ask, her brow creased, her voice gentle but insistent. "I just see you running yourself ragged." I'd get defensive. I'd say he was doing his best, that I believed in him and that we were a team. My mother, with her gentle eyes that had seen far too much betrayal in her own life, would nod and let me be. I never quite recognized the pity that flashed across her features. Maybe I didn't want to see it. The years passed in an unsteady rhythm. Every so often, a crisis would land in our lap. A letter from a creditor, a phone call from someone demanding unpaid money, a new proposition that required some initial investment, and I would scramble to cover it. I was told it was only temporary, that soon we'd be on top of things. And every time I felt my own reserves of hope depleting, he'd have a moment of genuine remorse that would reel me back in. He'd hold me close, whisper his regrets, talk about how he wished he could provide for me, how ashamed he felt that he was letting me do all the heavy lifting. He'd vow to fix it. Just give me another chance. I'll make it right, he'd say, voice trembling. And I wanted to believe him so badly that I would sink right back into that precarious arrangement. My family grew over time. I had children's, 2 daughters, each of them watching my life with wide eyes, absorbing the dynamic in ways I couldn't fully grasp. They saw me constantly on the edge of exhaustion, taking on extra shifts or picking up short-term gigs. They saw him pacing the living room, lost in thought, or returning late from failed business meetings. They grew up in a tension-filled household where love and financial strain coexisted in a strange, simmering brew. Sometimes I'd hear them whisper behind closed doors, wondering if we were about to lose our home or if we'd have to move again because another creditor was on our backs. I tried to shield them from the brunt of it, but children sense more than we give them credit for. One day, when my oldest daughter was about 14, she pulled me aside in the hallway. She looked so serious, her brow furrowed, a mixture of confusion and concern in her expression. "Mom," she said softly, "why do you do it? Why do you keep, letting this happen?" I didn't know how to answer. Because I loved him? Because I made a vow? Because I believed that in the end, a good person doesn't just walk away when things are hard? I remember standing there, swallowing a lump in my throat, wanting to give her a simple, inspiring answer. Instead, I just said, "He's your father, and I believe in loyalty." She nodded and looked unconvinced, but she let the matter drop. I carried her question with me for days afterward, turning it over in my mind. Why did I do it? It wasn't just for love, was it? A part of me had begun to define myself by my capacity to endure. If I admitted that I was drowning, then it would mean I was weak, that I had chosen poorly, that I couldn't hold my life together. So I decided to keep going, to keep paying off his debts, believing that my unrelenting loyalty was a virtue. But the years kept stacking up. By the time the children reached adulthood, I was a middle-aged woman who had spent more than half of her life trying to outrun the interest rates and final notices that never ceased. I should have celebrated the small triumphs, like finally paying off the last of one particular bank loan, or managing to fix the roof without taking out a new line of credit. But the victories were always overshadowed by the next crisis. My husband's face became more etched with lines, his eyes more restless as he chased one supposed golden opportunity after another. He aged, yet somehow he never matured past that desperate gambler's spirit. Meanwhile, I learned to navigate the complexities of budgets, extended payment plans, and debt consolidation. I became an expert in practical survival, while he became an expert in daydreams. Sometimes I'd lie awake at night, him asleep beside me, and my mind would wander to what my life might have been if I'd walked away sooner, or never taken on this burden at all. I wondered if there was a version of me out there in some alternate universe who was free to pursue her own ambitions, who used her energy to blossom, not to extinguish fires set by someone else. But I'd shove those thoughts aside, telling myself it was useless to dwell on what-ifs. I had chosen my path, and I was determined to see it through. My body started showing signs of wear. My back ached constantly. My hands had developed a tremor from years of stress. My hair was thinning at the temples. My face, once youthful and vibrant, carried a perpetual tiredness. And still, I labored on, ignoring my mother's quietly concerned phone calls and my daughter's not-so-subtle hints that maybe I should think about myself for once. The day I finally cleared the last of his major debts, I remember the exact date, though I pretend not to sometimes, was ironically anticlimactic. I was in my 50s. I had just gotten home from the bank, having transferred the final payment on a large consolidation loan that took almost a decade to pay off. My hands shook as I typed the PIN into the machine, and my eyes stung with tears. I felt something akin to liberation, but it was laced with bitterness. I should have been overjoyed, but instead I felt hollow, like I'd lost a huge part of my identity, as though the burden that had anchored me was suddenly gone and I was drifting aimlessly. I came home, found him sitting on the couch, half watching some inane program on television. He barely looked up when I walked in. I told him, "It's done. We're finally out of the hole. No more debts." He blinked, nodded slowly, and then said something like, "That's great, honey. Thanks." And then he turned back to the TV. I stood there, waiting for him to jump up, grab me, kiss me, thank me 1,000 times over, or break down and cry tears of joy. Instead, I got a subdued nod of acknowledgement. Maybe he was emotionally exhausted too. Maybe he was so accustomed to the grind that a resolution didn't register as a monumental event. Or maybe something else was already pulling him away from me. I didn't know. All I felt was an odd emptiness. I had sacrificed decades of my life, and in that moment, there was no grand gesture of gratitude or a relief, just an ambivalent acceptance of something he'd always expected me to do. It was in the weeks that followed that I noticed the changes. Subtle at first. He started spending more nights out, claiming he was meeting old friends or exploring a new business idea. He'd come home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. I would catch glimpses of him texting on his phone with a small smirk. My heart began to pound with a mix of fear and anger whenever he stepped out. I confronted him once or twice, and he'd deny anything was going on, acting affronted that I could even suggest such a betrayal, and yet the tension between us grew thicker by the day. My daughters, who were now adults and living their own lives, would occasionally ask if everything was all right. I forced a smile and told them things were fine. I had become so adept at lying about my own well-being that it came reflexively now. I suppose I was still clinging to the idea of loyalty, of never letting go of a relationship I had poured my entire existence into, and no matter how it might have rotted from the inside. I just wasn't prepared for what came next. One evening, I got a phone call from a neighbor. She sounded frantic, talking so fast he could barely understand. Apparently, my husband was seen in a nearby hotel lobby, stumbling around in a confused manner, accompanied by a younger woman who seemed impatient with him. The neighbor recognized him and immediately called me, worried something was wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs as I drove to that hotel. I imagined all sorts of scenarios. Maybe he had gotten into an accident. Maybe he was sick. Maybe the stress of his financial tangles had finally broken him. But I wasn't prepared for what I found. When I walked into the lobby, he was slumped in a chair, looking dazed, a bandage on his forehead. A woman with strikingly dyed red hair and a tight dress stood beside him, arms folded, glaring at me like I was the intruder. I approached him slowly, calling his name. He blinked, stared at me as though I was a stranger. He mumbled something about not remembering me. My stomach twisted. The desk clerk had already called an ambulance, suspecting some kind of head injury. I went with him to the hospital, sitting in the back of the ambulance, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The red-haired woman hovered at the edge of my vision, biting her lip nervously. At the hospital, the doctors told me he'd sustained a head injury, but it was relatively minor. There might be some temporary disorientation, maybe mild memory confusion. I clung to those words. Temporary, mild. But then he kept shaking his head at me, insisting he didn't know who I was, asking why I was hovering over him. "Stop acting like you're my wife," he snapped at one point, casting a furtive glance toward the red-haired woman. My entire body felt like it was on fire. The nurse eyed me with pity. There was a suggestion to keep him overnight for observation, and I stayed by his bedside, ignoring the withering glares from the mistress. I barely slept, my mind in turmoil. Did he really not remember, or was this some twisted ploy? I thought about how convenient it was that right when we'd finally escaped the clutches of debt, he had a reason to distance himself from me. I tried to shake off the cynicism, but it dug into my bones. The next morning, when he woke, he appeared more coherent, but his attitude toward me was ice cold. He regarded me with the same suspicion one might have toward a random stranger claiming kinship. The mistress, whose name turned out to be Justine, hovered protectively at his side. She glared at me every time I tried to speak to him. My attempts to jog his memory by recounting shared experiences only seemed to irritate him further. At one point, I mentioned the time we first met, how he had confided in me about his debts, how I'd stood by him through it all. He cringed, then retorted, "Stop lying. I don't know you. Justine told me you're some old friend who's always exaggerating your role in my life." My ears rang with those words. Some old friend. I felt a surge of anger, but also heartbreak. I turned to Justine. "He's my husband," I said through clenched teeth, "and you have no right to fill his head with lies." She just shrugged, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. He nodded, and his eyes flickered with a sort of contempt. The doctor told me the best course was to take him home and help him refamiliarize himself with his surroundings. So that's what I did. I brought him back to the house that we had struggled so long to keep, that I had poured all my effort into maintaining. He walked around with a distant look, as though he found it all vaguely unfamiliar. The mistress insisted on coming too, at least for a while, to make sure he was safe. I tried to protest, but he demanded that she stay, and I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to fight him on it in front of everyone. So she marched in, head held high, taking in the cramped spaces that had once been our home, reeking of our shared history. She wrinkled her nose, made a snide comment about the decor. Meanwhile, he stood in the living room, turning in slow circles, as though searching for something. I showed him old photographs, but he waved them off. I tried to remind him of our daughters, but he said he'd speak with them when he was ready. He carried himself like he was a guest in a cheap motel, forced there against his will. I couldn't reconcile this stranger with the man I had fought for all those years. Strangely, in the days that followed, he began to insist that Justine was his partner, that they'd been together for a while, and that if he'd been married to me at all, it must have been a very long time ago. In his mind, I was some relic from his past. I tried to glean more information about how they met, about how long this affair had been going on, but neither of them would give me a straight answer. Justine would smirk, and he would scowl and say something about my prying. The injustice of it all made my chest tighten until I could scarcely breathe. I was being cast aside after devoting 3 decades of my life to wiping his slate clean. All my nightmares about losing my identity had come true in a single, vicious swoop. My older daughter came to visit one afternoon. She walked into the living room, spotted her father sitting there with this strange woman beside him, and she froze. He greeted her with a strained politeness, clearly not recognizing his own child. My daughter's eyes filled with tears as she tried to talk to him, reminding him of her childhood memories, the games he used to play with her. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Justine, who gave him a look that seemed to say, "Don't let her guilt trip you." He ended up shaking his head and muttering something about how the stress of the accident might have warped certain memories, that he couldn't confirm or deny anything yet. My daughter ran out of the house in tears. I wanted to chase after her, but I felt this unstoppable wave of fury building inside me. "You remember nothing of your own daughter?" I hissed at him. He just shrugged and said, "I can't fake memories to make you all happy." I realized then that I'd never seen him so cold and detached. It was as though the man I once knew had been replaced by an emotional void. And yet, in fleeting moments, I'd see him sneaking a look at old photos or pausing at the threshold of our bedroom as though some distant recollection tugged at his mind. He would glance at me with an odd mixture of curiosity and dislike, as though he couldn't fathom how I fit into his life. Meanwhile, Justine started bringing in her own possessions inch by inch. displacing mine. She'd hang her dresses in the closet, move my skincare products aside in the bathroom cabinet, rearrange the living room furniture. She acted as though she was the new mistress of the house, and I was just some unfortunate roommate. When I tried to stand my ground, my husband would side with her. The humiliation was staggering. My own home, which had once symbolized all my sacrifice, was being colonized by this younger woman who reeked of perfume I'd never wear, who touched him with a brazen claim I couldn't refute because he refused to acknowledge me as his wife. I found myself seething with resentment, but also heartbreak and a strange sort of numbness. I kept thinking, this can't be real. He can't have forgotten everything. But day after day, he acted as though he was living with an old acquaintance, forced together by circumstance. He took up with Justine in the master bedroom, leaving me to find sleep wherever I could, usually on the couch or sometimes in the guest room that had once been a storage space. I would lay there at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was a deeper layer of betrayal at play. Had he lied about the memory loss? Was the injury not that severe? And he was simply using it as a convenient excuse to free himself from the marriage he'd once so desperately needed? It was a dark thought, and it stung to imagine that all my faith in him had led to this grand deception. But I couldn't discount the possibility. When the hospital ran further tests, the doctors maintained that there was no clear reasoning for complete memory erasure. They found no severe trauma that would justify such a profound amnesia. They posited that stress or psychological factors might be influencing his recollection. Still, they had no definitive answers. His refusal to attend therapy sessions with me only deepened my suspicions. Our neighbors, the ones who had known us for years, were aghast. They'd whisper behind my back, try to offer me pitying smiles or casserole dishes. Some confronted him, telling him to get his head on straight. He responded by avoiding them, sticking close to Justine. My mother, now old and frail, asked me quietly if I needed a place to stay. I almost accepted, but a stubborn part of me wanted to cling to the house I had fought so hard to keep. I had poured my entire adult life into maintaining that property, paying off every loan, every overdue bill, scrubbing its floors into the night. I refused to be chased out, so I stayed, but I lived like a ghost in my own walls. They walked past me as though I was invisible. My husband would occasionally speak to me, but only to discuss some practical matter like the grocery list or the utility bills. The rest of the time, he was locked in conversation with her. Or he was out somewhere on new business escapades that I was no longer privy to. My health began to suffer. The stress, the resentment, the heartbreak, it all took a toll. I struggled to sleep, my appetite dwindled. My daughters begged me to leave, to come stay with them. But I was too proud, or too foolish, or too determined to see if I could spark his memory. I can't pinpoint exactly when things shifted. Maybe it was that afternoon I found him in the old workshop at the back of the house, staring at a box of keepsakes we'd stored there years ago. A box that contained letters he'd written me during our early courtship, pictures from our modest wedding, random trinkets that symbolized milestones in our life together. He was holding a faded photo of us standing outside this very house, a sold sign in my hands, a look of naive happiness plastered on both our faces. He glanced at me, confusion swirling behind his eyes. "You look so different," he muttered. "Younger. Happier." I bit my lip, tears threatening to spill over. "That was a long time ago," I said. He set the photo down and rummaged further, pulling out a small crocheted blanket. It was something I'd made during my first pregnancy. I watched his fingers tremble slightly as he ran them over the stitches. For a moment, he looked like he was about to say something meaningful, maybe an apology or a confession. But then Justine appeared in the doorway, calling his name. He dropped the blanket as though it burned him, walked out without another word. I stood there, feeling the thickness of the air, the weight of unspoken memories. I realized in that moment that part of him was fighting to resurface, but fear guilt, or maybe some twisted sense of freedom was holding him back. I decided I wouldn't leave just yet. If there was even a sliver of chance to salvage his memory, I wanted to be here for it. Of course, that decision led to more nights of torment, listening to them in the next room, laughing or arguing, going through the motions of a relationship that should have been mine. I found solace in small routines. I'd water the garden early in the morning, walk the perimeter of the house, run my hand along its chipped paint, remembering all the times I'd repainted it with my own two hands, all the times I'd hammered nails into its walls or scrubbed its floors till they shone. Each step felt like a claim. This is mine. These memories are mine, and no mistress or memory loss can steal that. I started to piece together bits of evidence that might hint at a deeper scheme. Old phone bills, receipts for jewelries or hotel rooms, messages on social media. It appeared he'd been involved with Justine for nearly 2 years before the injury. They traveled together, dined at expensive places while I'd been at home budgeting for groceries. The memory loss might still be real to some extent, or it might be a convenient cover for him to discard the life he'd once considered burdensome. Rage welled up inside me, and I found myself confronted with a choice. Should I confront him with this evidence and risk pushing him further away? Or should I wait and hope his conscience resurfaces on its own? In the end, I decided to confront him. I cornered him in the living room one afternoon when Justine was out running errands. I showed him the receipts, the messages. I demanded an explanation. He took the papers from my hand, glanced through them, and frowned. "If these are true," he said quietly, "then I must have been planning to leave you." I swallowed hard. He spoke so calmly, as though discussing the weather. "Why? After everything?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shrugged. "It looks like I had reasons. Maybe I felt trapped. You act like I owe you a lifetime just because you chose to pay off some debts." I gaped at him. "Some debts? I gave up 3 decades of my life, 30 years, to fix your mistakes. We built this life together. How can you dismiss all of that?" He stared at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of guilt. Maybe even recognition. But then he shook his head. "I can't remember any of it. I just see facts. You chose to spend your life working off my debts, and now you act like I'm obligated to stay with you. That's not how it works." I felt my composure slip. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I thought we were partners. I thought you loved me, that's why I did it." He sighed, almost pityingly. "Love can fade. People change." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there with the weight of my heartbreak pressing down on me. Everything I had done, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every year of my youth spent in worry had been dismissed as my own fault. I sank onto the couch, numb with disbelief. In the following days, the tension in the house grew unbearable. My daughters demanded I take legal action, throw him and his mistress out, fight for what was mine. They pointed out that the house was in my name now, that I had the right to evict them both. But I felt paralyzed by emotional exhaustion. I'd given so much of myself to this man that the thought of actively fighting him left me with a strange sense of dread, yet a flicker of anger began to grow within me, a slow burn that threatened to consume my heartbreak. Late one night, after pacing my bedroom for hours, I made a decision. I would consult a lawyer. I made the appointment in secret, not wanting to alert him or Justine. The lawyer listened to my story with a mixture of shock and empathy. She told me that legally I had a strong case. The house was paid for almost entirely by my earnings. My name was on the deed, and if he truly remembered nothing, that might work in my favor if it came to a legal battle. She suggested that I consider a separation or divorce, that I protect my assets before he could try to manipulate his way into taking half. It felt surreal to speak of divorce, to imagine severing a bond I'd spent 30 years fortifying. But the conversation with my lawyer ignited a spark of determination. I didn't want to be the victim any longer. I'd spent enough time in that role. When I came home from the lawyer's office, I found him sitting alone at the dining table, looking at old photographs again. Justine was nowhere in sight. He glanced up at me, and for a moment we just stared at each other. I saw something flicker in his eyes, a mixture of confusion, regret, maybe a hint of longing. Then he set the photos aside, rubbing his temples. I keep seeing flashes, he admitted quietly, little pieces of memory, but they're vague. I don't know if they're real or if I'm just imagining them. I crossed my arms over my chest. And what do these flashes tell you? He let out a shaky breath. They tell me that I used to love you, that we struggled, but I never questioned your devotion. I don't know why I would leave that behind. My heart clenched. Because you had a mistress, I reminded him, my voice trembling with anger. He closed his eyes. I can't explain it. Maybe I felt suffocated. Maybe I thought I deserved more. All I know is that right now, I don't feel the history you say we had. I can't force it. I walked over to the table, placed my hands on its surface, stared into his eyes. I won't beg you to remember, but I won't be thrown away. I've spoken to a lawyer. His gaze snapped to mine, alarmed. A liar? Yes, I said firmly. We're married. Or at least, we were. If you insist on living this new life with your mistress, that's your choice. But I'm not going to let you walk away with everything I've worked for. He tensed, a flicker of fear in his eyes. You'd really do that? I have no choice, I whispered. You forced my hand. He looked away, and for a moment I wondered if he felt the weight of what he'd done. The next day he was gone. He packed a small bag, left a note that simply said he needed space to figure things out, that he couldn't live under the same roof anymore. Justine was also gone, having left a short while before him. I found myself alone in the house, the quiet pressing against my ears. It was a strange sensation, being free from his presence after so many years of chasing his financial shadows. My initial reaction was an odd blend of relief and sorrow. Had I driven him away, or had he finally gathered the courage to do what he was always planning to do? I couldn't decide. I spent the next few weeks in a fog. I consulted more with my lawyer, started the process of legally securing my house, and reached out to my daughters to explain the situation. They were supportive, relieved even, and encouraged me to move forward with the divorce. But a part of me couldn't shake the longing for closure, for a real explanation, for some acknowledgement of how deeply I had given myself to him. Then, out of nowhere, he returned, standing on the porch one late afternoon, head bowed, a suitcase at his feet. I opened the door, heart pounding, bracing myself for another round of emotional whiplash. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes, hair unkempt. I remember more, he said softly, almost shyly. I don't have it all, but enough. Enough to know what I've done. Enough to know I betrayed you. I'm not here to beg forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I realize how much I used you, how much I took from you. I remember everything you sacrificed. I stared at him, anger, sadness, and a bizarre relief warring within me. And what do you want? I asked. He swallowed hard. Just the chance to talk. I'm not with Justine anymore. It was. It doesn't matter. She left when she realized I wasn't going to magically inherit some fortune or something. She said she was tired of my confusion. I've lost everything. except for these fragmented memories that keep coming back. I just want to talk to see if you can ever forgive me. My hands shook as I gripped the doorknob. Forgiveness. After all he'd done, after everything he'd put me through, I thought back to my mother's words, to my daughter's pleas, to my own sense of self-preservation. And yet, the part of me that had loved him for decades whispered that maybe this was the closure I needed. I invited him inside. We sat in the living room, not quite facing each other. He stared at the space around him, as though he recognized it and yet felt alienated from it. He said he vaguely remembered pockets of our life together, moments in the kitchen, nights we spent worrying about bills, birthdays with the children. And with each memory, he said he was overwhelmed by guilt for how he'd taken me for granted. I don't remember how I fell in with Justine, he said, voice trembling. But I know I must have been looking for some escape, some excitement. I was so focused on trying to outrun the shame of all my failures that I forgot who was standing by my side. I listened silently, my throat tight. So what now? I asked. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. I don't expect you to want me back. I want you to know I realize the gravity of my mistakes. And I'm truly sorry. A heavy silence settled between us. I thought of all the years I'd spent cleaning up after him, of the humiliations, the rejections, the callous way he'd dismissed me when I needed his gratitude the most. I thought of how a single apology, no matter how genuine, couldn't erase decades of sorrow. Yet I also felt a twist of compassion. For better or worse, this man had been the center of my life for so long, and I knew that holding on to hatred would only poison the rest of my years. I took a deep breath. I appreciate that you're acknowledging it, I said slowly. But that doesn't guarantee I can move past it. I've lost so much time, so much of myself, chasing your debts, enduring your betrayals. I don't know if I can find a way to trust you or to let you close to me again. He bowed his head. I understand. We spent the next hours talking, and him recounting the memories that returned to him, me filling in the gaps where I could stand to. We didn't argue. It was a subdued, almost sorrowful exchange of truth long ignored. By the end, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house was cast in shadows. I turned on a lamp, watching the faint glow illuminate the worry lines in his face. He asked if he could stay the night, not in the same bed, of course, just until he found a place to go. I said yes, albeit hesitantly. And so began a tentative cohabitation. The difference was that now he treated me with a strange mixture of reverence and shame. He'd apologize for minor inconveniences, show gratitude for the simplest acts. But I felt uneasy, like a caretaker for a man who was both my husband and a stranger. My daughters were furious that he was back. They thought I was setting myself up for more heartbreak. Maybe I was. But I couldn't bring myself to throw him out in the cold just yet. I needed time to decide what my own heart wanted. For weeks, we fell into a rhythm. He'd try to prove he could be useful, fixing things around the house, cooking dinner, paying for groceries when he could. He'd found a temporary job at a local workshop. I tried not to let down my guard. Gradually, though, I noticed weariness in him that was new. The flamboyant dream chaser was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely haunted by regret. One night, over a simple meal, he asked me if I thought there was any hope for us. I looked at him and remembered the young woman I was when we first met, full of passion and a misguided sense of loyalty that had cost me 3 decades. The bitterness was still there, but so was a kernel of empathy for a man who, in many ways, had squandered his own life, too. I told him I needed time, that maybe we could try therapy if he was sincere. He agreed without hesitation. We began seeing a counselor together. It was awkward, painful, filled with tears and revelations. He confessed that he'd always felt deep inadequacy for failing to provide, and that those feelings twisted into resentment when he realized I was carrying the load without him. Instead of confronting his shortcomings, he sought out an affair that made him feel desired and powerful. It was easier to pretend he was someone else with Justine, unshackled by the guilt of watching me break my back to fix his mistakes. Hearing him articulate that cut deep, but it also offered a strange sense of validation. I realized that in my determination to fix his life, I'd never let him properly face the consequences of his failures. Perhaps I enabled him. It didn't excuse his betrayal, but it shed light on the poison that had seeped into our dynamic. The counseling sessions continued. Some days I left feeling drained and hopeless. Other days I felt a glimmer of possibility. He approached my daughters to apologize, though they received his words with skepticism. My older daughter told him flat out she couldn't forgive him yet. My younger daughter, a bit more soft-hearted, gave him a reserved hug. He started doing things he'd never done before, like building an emergency fund, handling some of the household bills, asking for my input on decisions instead of just expecting me to fix everything. It was startling to see him take responsibility, albeit late in life. Yet I found my guard raising whenever he seemed too eager to prove himself. I had nightmares of him running off with another mistress the moment he felt secure. But at least, in therapy, he seemed genuine about tackling his demons. Months passed in this uneasy dance. My mother, though frail, visited once or twice, glancing at him warily. She offered me quiet support, reassuring me that I didn't have to give him another chance if I didn't want to. I knew that, but part of me wanted to see if redemption was truly possible. Maybe because I needed closure, maybe because I still had a ghost of love for him in my heart. One evening, after an especially grueling therapy session, we returned home. He walked into the living room, hesitated, then turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I remember our wedding day," he said softly. "The borrowed dress, how it was too long, the way you lifted it so you wouldn't trip. I remember how you looked at me, like I was the most important person in the world. And I remember feeling this surge of gratitude that I'd found someone so devoted. I'm sorry I ever let that fade." I stared at him, tears forming in my own eyes. "You can't rewrite history," I said, my voice trembling. "But you can decide how you live from now on." He nodded, swallowing hard. We stood there, the weight of decades pressing down on us. I felt something shift within me, a cautious acceptance that maybe we could piece together a new life. Not the same as before, but something honest and real, built on the shattered remnants of our past. We continued therapy, had countless late-night talks, peeled back layers of old hurts and resentments. We argued, we cried, we apologized. Bit by bit, we confronted the ways we'd both contributed to this broken marriage. I felt my anger morph from a fiery blaze to a lingering ache, still present, but no longer consuming. I began to consider the possibility of forgiving him, not for his sake alone, but for mine. I realized that carrying bitterness for the rest of my days would only erode what was left of my spirit. Forgiveness, I came to see, was less about excusing him and more about freeing myself from the prison of the past. Finally, one evening, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the same one that used to wobble, though he'd finally fixed it. I told him I was ready to try again, under strict conditions. We would both continue therapy, he would respect my boundaries, and we would not fall back into the old pattern where I carried all the burdens. He agreed. Tears welled in his eyes and he reached for my hand. For the first time in years, I let him hold it without recoiling. A hush fell over the room, one that felt both peaceful and charged with the knowledge of all we'd endured. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a step. We have plenty of work ahead. I still haven't fully reconciled the fact that I lost 30 years of my life chasing his debts, Nor have I forgotten the humiliation of watching him return with a mistress, claiming no memory of me. But there's a sense of something new blooming in the cracks, an acceptance that what happened is part of our story, but not the whole story. And in the quiet moments when I catch him looking at me with remorse and something akin to renewed devotion, I feel a stir of hope that maybe the future can be different. I don't know if I'll ever forget the betrayal or the years I sacrificed, but maybe the key is learning to carry those memories without letting them dictate the rest of my life. It's a precarious balance, holding on to my newfound sense of self-worth while opening my heart to the man who once shattered it. Still, I'm choosing to stand on the remains of our broken past, trying to build something sturdier, something that might stand the test of whatever remains of our lives. I used to think of loyalty as never leaving, no matter how painful the situation. Now I see it as committing to a path of honesty and growth, whether that means staying together or walking away. For now, we're walking side by side, unsure of every step, but determined to find our footing on steadier ground. I suppose that's the best we can do? Honor the scars while daring to keep living. Keep trying. Keep hoping that redemption is possible, no matter how bitterly hard won.